My grandmother always said her will would reveal the truth about all of us. I, 27 female, always believed my grandmother, Eleanor Whitmore, would outlive all of us. She had the kind of presence that made time feel slower around her, as though the world itself adjusted to her rhythm. Even in her late 80s, she maintained control over everything she touched. Her estate ran like a perfectly tuned machine, her staff loyal to a fault, and her family, fractured as we were, still orbited her like she was the center of gravity. When she died, it didn't feel real. It felt like something permanent had shifted in a way none of us were prepared to understand. By the time we gathered at her estate a few days later, the house already felt different. It was the same sprawling property, the same polished floors and towering windows, the same carefully curated rooms filled with objects that told stories only she fully understood. But something invisible had changed. The air felt heavier, like the house was waiting for something. I arrived just before noon, lingering outside for a moment longer than necessary. The long gravel drive, the towering oak trees, and the carefully trimmed hedges looked untouched, almost preserved. Inside, it was anything but. Family members filled the space in scattered clusters. Some stood close together, speaking quietly. Others kept their distance, watching more than participating. The grief was there, but it was uneven. In some, it looked genuine. In others, it felt secondary to something more immediate, more calculating. That was when I saw Patrick. He stood near the fireplace, posture relaxed but precise, as if every movement had been considered ahead of time. He looked exactly as I remembered him, controlled, confident, and slightly removed from everything around. We had grown up in the same house for a time, though we had never been close. Where I observed, he acted. Where I hesitated, he advanced. My grandmother had always taken an interest in both of us, but in very different ways. With me, she had been patient. With him, she had been expectant. As our eyes met across the room, there was a brief moment of recognition that carried more weight than it should have. It wasn't warmth or familiarity. It was something sharper. Something competitive. I looked away first. We were called into the sitting room soon after. It was one of the largest rooms in the house, designed for gatherings that were meant to impress. Tall windows filtered in pale light, illuminating the long table at the center where everything would be decided. At the head of that table sat Mr. Davenport, my grandmother's attorney. He had been part of her life for decades, a quiet but constant presence who knew more about her intentions than anyone else in the room. We took our seats slowly, the weight of the moment settling over us. The reading of the will began in a way that almost felt reassuring. Small gifts were distributed, charities were named, and long-serving staff were acknowledged and rewarded. It followed a structure that suggested fairness, or at least predictability. For a brief moment, it felt like everything might proceed normally. Then the tone shifted. There was a subtle change in the way Mr. Davenport carried himself, a slight hesitation that broke the rhythm of what had come before. It was enough to draw attention and signal that what followed would not be as straightforward. The estate, he explained, would not be divided or shared. Instead, it would be awarded in full to a single individual. The reaction was immediate, though. Mostly contained. Shock moved through the room in quiet ways. Everything would go to one person. The implications settled quickly. This was no longer about inheritance in the traditional sense. It was something else entirely. The decision of who would receive everything would not be based on prior arrangements or written allocations. It would depend on a condition set by my grandmother before her passing. All eligible heirs were required to remain within the estate for 30 days. At the end of that time, whoever remained would inherit everything. The simplicity of it was almost unsettling. There were no additional instructions. The meaning, however, was unmistakable. The room reacted in waves. Disbelief came first, followed by frustration, then something quieter and far more dangerous: acceptance. Because for all the objections, for all the claims that it was unreasonable or unfair, no one stood up to walk away. The possibility of losing everything outweighed the discomfort of staying. I glanced at Patrick again. His reaction was different from the others. There was no visible frustration, no confusion, only focus. As if the situation, however unexpected, had already been processed and understood. The first night unfolded with a sense of forced normalcy that felt almost artificial. Dinner was served as it always had been, with an excess of food and a level of formality that no one seemed entirely comfortable maintaining. The long table was filled, though the seating felt more strategic than natural. People chose positions carefully, aligning themselves with allies or distancing themselves from perceived threats. Conversations took place, but they lacked substance. I found it difficult to engage. My attention drifted constantly, drawn instead to the subtle dynamics unfolding around the table. People were observing each other, measuring reactions and noting who seemed most affected and who remained composed. Patrick remained composed. From across the table, he appeared entirely at ease. His posture was relaxed and his expression neutral, but there was an alertness beneath it all. He wasn't distracted by the surface-level interactions. His focus moved from person to person, lingering just long enough to gather something before shifting again. After dinner, the house began to divide itself naturally. Smaller groups formed, conversations lowered, and movement through the space became more purposeful. Some people retreated to their rooms early, as if seeking distance from the tension. Others lingered, unwilling to separate from the shifting dynamics. I stepped outside onto the terrace, needing space from the weight of it all. The night air was cool, the ground stretching out into darkness beyond the reach of the house lights. It should have been calming. Instead, it felt isolating. The estate, which had once felt expansive and open, now seemed contained. As though the boundaries had closed in, turning it into something closer to a pressure chamber than a home. From that vantage point, the situation became clearer. This was not just about staying, it was about what would happen while we stayed. The next morning marked the beginning of a pattern. The first departure came early, framed as an unavoidable obligation. It was presented with reluctance, with the appropriate level of regret, but there was something beneath it that didn't match the surface. Relief. It was subtle, but it was there. The second and third departures followed within hours. Different explanations, similar outcomes. Each time someone left, the atmosphere shifted. The house grew quieter but not calmer. By the third day, the changes became harder to ignore. Food that had been available the day before was suddenly gone or reduced. It started a pattern of a slow erosion of comfort and a steady increase in tension. Frustration surfaced in indirect ways. Conversations grew shorter and less patient. Movements through shared spaces became more deliberate, as if everyone was aware of being watched or assessed. Trust, which had never been particularly strong to begin with, began to dissolve, and there was only one person who seemed completely in control of how it was unfolding. Patrick wasn't reacting to the situation, he was waiting for it to reach the point where he could use it. And as I watched the family begin to fracture under the pressure, by the end of the first week, the house no longer resembled a place of mourning. Grief had not disappeared, but it had been replaced by something far more corrosive. The structure of daily life remained intact on the surface. Meals were served, rooms were maintained, and the staff continued their duties with quiet professionalism. But beneath that thin layer of order, everything had shifted. The family had divided itself without ever formally acknowledging it. Alliances formed in subtle ways. Certain people began to sit together consistently and moved through the house in pairs or small groups. They would exchange information in hushed tones that stopped the moment someone else approached. Others isolated themselves entirely, withdrawing into their rooms as if distance alone could protect them from what was unfolding. I found myself somewhere in between. I observed more than I participated, though that position became increasingly difficult to maintain. It was impossible to remain entirely neutral in an environment that seemed designed to pull people into conflict. The small disruptions continued, growing more frequent and slightly more pointed. Personal items would appear in the wrong rooms, creating confusion that quickly turned into suspicion. Food supplies fluctuated unpredictably, with certain preferred items disappearing entirely while others remained untouched. Individually, none of these incidents were significant enough to confront directly. But together, they created a steady undercurrent of distrust. The effect was gradual but undeniable. Conversations became guarded and eye contact lingered a little too long, as if each person was searching for confirmation of something they could not yet prove. The sense of shared experience, of being part of the same family, began to erode. The departures continued, though less frequently now. Those who remained had already made a choice, whether consciously or not. They had decided that the potential reward outweighed the growing discomfort. Or perhaps they had convinced themselves they could outlast the others. Patrick moved through all of this with a level of consistency that set him apart. When food supplies became unpredictable, he adjusted his routine without visible frustration. When tensions rose in shared spaces, he removed himself before becoming entangled in them. He maintained a distance that was not quite isolation, but close enough to protect him from the worst of the conflict. Certain individuals were affected more than others. Those who reacted strongly and showed visible frustration or anxiety seemed to experience more frequent disturbances. Their belongings were the ones most often misplaced. Their routines were the ones most often interrupted. The house was no longer a passive setting. It was a system. Late one evening, the house had grown quiet, and most of the remaining family members had retreated to their rooms. I was passing through one of the smaller sitting areas when I noticed something that had not been there before. A set of documents, partially tucked beneath a stack of books. They were not hidden carefully, just enough to avoid immediate notice. That alone would not have drawn my attention, but the paper itself did. It was the same thick, formal stock that Mr. Davenport had used during the reading of the will. I hesitated, then I moved closer. The top page contained a heading I recognized immediately. An addendum. My grandmother's will had not been as simple as it had first appeared. The contents were brief, but their implications were not. There were additional conditions, not for everyone but for two individuals. Patrick and myself. The wording was precise, as everything my grandmother ever arranged tended to be. It outlined a secondary clause that would only come into effect if certain criteria were met. If, at the end of the 30 days, both Patrick and I remained, the estate would not automatically go to either of us. Instead, a final determination would be made based on an evaluation of conduct during the 30-day period. It meant that simply staying was not enough, but how we stayed mattered. And more importantly, it meant that my grandmother had anticipated exactly what was happening. She had designed the situation to reveal the cracks in the family. I stood there for a long moment, the weight of that realization settling in. This was not just a test of endurance, it was a test of character. And Patrick either did not know that, or he knew and believed he could shape the outcome anyway. I left the documents exactly where I had found them. But from that moment on, I understood the game differently. And for the first time since arriving at the estate, I began to consider not just how to survive it, but how to win it. The second week marked a turning point. The atmosphere within the house shifted from tension into something more deliberate. The uncertainty that had characterized the first few days began to settle into patterns of behavior that were easier to recognize, though no less unsettling. Fewer people remained now. The initial group had been reduced steadily, each departure leaving behind a more concentrated version of the same dynamics. Those who stayed were no longer uncertain about their decision. They had committed to it fully, whether out of determination, pride, or something more complex. With fewer people, the interactions became more direct. There was less room to avoid one another, less opportunity to disappear into the background. Every movement through the house felt more visible. The disruptions did not stop. What had once been subtle inconveniences began to take on a sharper edge. Schedules were interrupted in ways that forced confrontation. Spaces that had felt private no longer offered the same sense of security. The balance between shared and personal environments blurred, creating constant friction. Fatigue set in. Not just physical, but mental. It became difficult to maintain composure under the constant pressure. Small frustrations lingered longer than they should have, and minor inconveniences felt disproportionate. And with each passing day, the margin for patience grew thinner. I adapted in my own way. Rather than reacting to each disruption, I began to anticipate them. I simplified my routines, reduced my reliance on shared resources, and avoided patterns that could be easily predicted or interrupted. It was not a perfect solution, but it created a sense of stability that made the environment more manageable. More importantly, it allowed me to observe without becoming entangled. Patrick's behavior remained consistent, but there were subtle changes. He had become more active, not in ways that drew attention, but in the frequency of his movements through the house, the timing of his appearances in shared spaces, and the way he positioned himself within conversations without fully participating in them. He was adjusting his approach. The others were beginning to notice, though not in a coordinated way. Suspicion had spread, but it lacked focus. Different people attributed the disruptions to different causes, often based on their own experiences, rather than any clear pattern. This fragmentation worked in his favor. As long as the suspicion remained scattered, it could not be directed. And as long as it could not be directed, it could not be confronted. The addendum to the will remained in the back of my mind. It changed the way I interpreted everything. Patrick's actions were no longer just about outlasting the others. They were about shaping perception. If the final decision depended on conduct, then the appearance of control, of composure, of justification would matter just as much as the reality. He was creating an environment where others would appear unstable. Another departure came midway through the week, more abrupt than the others. There was no extended explanation, no attempt to justify the decision beyond what was necessary. He simply left, the strain of the environment having reached a point where continuing was no longer worth it. The effect on the remaining group was immediate. The possibility of leaving became more acceptable. By the end of the second week, the number of remaining heirs had been reduced to a small handful. The house felt larger as a result, but also more confined. Every interaction carried weight, and every decision felt amplified. The sense of being observed and evaluated had become constant. And beneath it all, there was a growing awareness that the end of the 30 days was approaching, that the final outcome was no longer abstract. It was coming. And as I watched the others continue to fray at the edges, I began to understand that this was where the real test lay, not in surviving the environment, but in refusing to let it reshape you. Patrick, for all his control, was not unchanged. He was becoming more focused and more committed to the role he had created for himself. And in that commitment, there was something that suggested he could not step outside of it, even if he needed to. While he was shaping the environment around him, he was also becoming part of it. And when the time came for everything to be judged, that distinction might be the only thing that separated us. By the beginning of the third week, the house had settled into a kind of strained stillness that felt more unsettling than the earlier tension. There were so few of us left that avoidance was no longer possible. Every shared space carried the weight of presence, every quiet moment felt observed, and every routine seemed to take on an exaggerated importance. The disruptions had not stopped, but they had changed again. They were no longer frequent enough to feel chaotic. Instead, they appeared at precise moments, carefully timed in ways that made them feel almost intentional in their restraint. A misplaced item would appear just when someone seemed to regain their composure. A routine interruption would occur after a stretch of relative calm. The house dynamic was no longer sharp or reactive, but dull and constant, the kind that made it difficult to think clearly, to separate what was happening from how it felt. Small decisions required more effort. Emotions lingered longer than they should have. By the end of the third week, only a handful of us remained: Patrick, myself, and two others who had managed, through their own methods, to endure the same pressures that had driven everyone else away. But even among the remaining group, there was a difference. The others were unraveling slowly. Not in dramatic ways, but in subtle, visible shifts. Their movements had become less certain, their interactions more strained. They second-guessed themselves and reacted to minor inconveniences with disproportionate frustration. They were still present, but they were no longer steady. Patrick noticed. His movements became more deliberate as the days passed. He positioned himself carefully within shared spaces, appearing at moments that allowed him to observe the others at their most unsettled. He maintained his composure with near-perfect consistency, presenting himself as unaffected by the environment that was clearly impacting everyone else. It was no longer just strategy. It was performance. And it was convincing. If the final judgment depended on appearances as much as reality, he was building a case that would be difficult to challenge. But there was a subtle flaw. One that only became visible if you looked closely enough. There was no variation, no moment of genuine uncertainty or reaction. Every response and every expression felt measured and contained. It created an impression of stability, but it also created distance. It made him appear separate from the experience rather than part of it. And that separation, I realized, might matter more than he understood. My grandmother had not designed this to reward detachment. She had designed it to reveal truth. The final departures happened quietly. The third remaining heir left first, their decision coming without announcement. One day they were present, moving through the house with the same strained determination as before. The next, they were gone without explanation. The last remaining person lasted 2 more days. By then, the pressure had become unmistakable. Their composure had eroded to the point where even small disruptions triggered visible reactions. They moved through the house with a kind of restless urgency, as if trying to stay ahead of something they could not see. When they finally left, it felt inevitable. That left only 2. The house felt different again. There was a clarity to it now, a sense that everything had narrowed to a single point. The complexity of multiple interactions had been replaced by something more direct. There was no longer any question about the outcome. It would come down to us. The remaining days passed without the same level of disruption. The pattern had served its purpose. There was no one left to unsettle but us. Without the constant external disturbances, the environment became more reflective. There was more space to think and more time to consider what had happened and what it meant. I found myself moving through the house differently. I no longer felt the need to anticipate disruptions or adjust to shifting dynamics. Instead, I focused on maintaining a sense of steadiness, of continuity that was not influenced by what had come before. Patrick did the same, but his controlled approach remained unchanged. He maintained the same level of composure he had held from the beginning. In his mind, that was enough, but the addendum still lingered in mine. Conduct would determine the outcome, not just survival. As the final day approached, that distinction became everything. The 30th day arrived without ceremony. There was no announcement, no acknowledgement from the house or its staff. The morning unfolded like any other, quiet and measured, the routine so familiar by that point that it almost felt detached from the significance of what it represented. But the weight of it was there. Patrick and I moved through the space with a shared awareness that the end had come. There was no need for discussion, no attempt to address what had passed between us over the previous weeks. Everything that needed to be revealed already had been. By midday, we were called back into the sitting room. The same room where it had begun. Mr. Davenport was already there, the documents in front of him prepared with the same precision as before. His expression was neutral, but there was a gravity to it that had not been present during the initial reading. This was not a continuation, it was a conclusion. We took our seats, but the silence felt different now. Mr. Davenport began without delay, outlining the fulfillment of the initial condition. The 30 days had passed, and the requirement had been met. There were 2 remaining heirs. The final determination would be made based on the additional clause, the evaluation of conduct. He spoke carefully, as though each word carried weight beyond its immediate meaning. The assessment, he explained, had been conducted through multiple sources. Observations from staff, documented patterns of behavior, and my grandmother's own criteria for what constituted worthiness. It was not a simple judgment. It was a comprehensive one. My grandmother had not been looking for someone who could control others. She had been looking for someone who could remain themselves when control was no longer possible. When Mr. Davenport reached the final statement, the outcome felt both inevitable and surreal. The estate would pass in full to me. The words settled into the room with a quiet finality. I did not look at Patrick right away. When I finally did, his expression was unchanged and composed, but there was something beneath it. Something close to realization. As if, in that moment, he understood the flaw in his approach. He had treated the situation as something to be managed. But in doing so, he had become defined by it. The rest unfolded quickly. Formalities were completed and documents were signed. The structure that had governed the past 30 days dissolved as efficiently as it had been created. By the time the process was finished, the house felt different again. The pressure that had defined it was gone, leaving behind something quieter, more neutral. I walked through the rooms one last time before leaving. The spaces felt familiar again, though not in the same way they had before. They carried the weight of the choices that had been made within them. But they no longer felt oppressive. As I stepped outside, the air felt lighter. The estate stretched out before me, unchanged in its appearance, but entirely altered in what it represented. My grandmother had been right. Not just about who would inherit her estate, but about who we all were when placed under pressure. And, in the end, it had not been about endurance, but the ability to remain unchanged when everything around you was designed to make you otherwise. That was the truth she had wanted to reveal. And it was the only thing that truly mattered.